my pleasure and honor to introduce Burke Rochford. How many of you are from a Christian background? Okay, just to clear, he's a sociology professor, he's not Santa Claus. Have you seen him? I just don't want anybody disappointed when he starts, he's not going to have a big bag, there's no toys, this is the serious part of the program, okay? So, okay, having dealt with that detail, Burke Rochford is a professor emeritus. He's a sociologist by profession. He is a professor, has been a professor. He is now retired from that, therefore given this honorary title of professor emeritus. He was teaching at, is it still college? Is it university?
No, it's college.
Middlebury College in Vermont. Beautiful campus, wonderful place. And he taught there for 32 years. Okay, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're under 32 years of age. Okay. So if so, you can talk to him later about what happened before you came. He'd be happy to fill you in on all that stuff. Burke has actually been, okay, let's see. Raise your hand if you were born before 1970, after 1975. Take a look around, Burke. Okay. Okay. Raise your hand if you've been a member of ISKCON 1975 or earlier. Raise your hand. How many of us here? Okay, a few. Okay, so just catch these numbers here. He began studying ISKCON as a sociology professor. You were a grad student? As a professor. Excuse me, as a grad student before he became a professor. Began studying ISKCON in 1975. Okay, that's a long time ago. So for those of you that were born came in 1975 or later, thank you very much for being specimens. Much appreciated. And he's going to share with us, he's written books about ISKCON, he's given many, many papers. And on top of everything, Burke is actually a friend of our society. He's a personal friend of mine. My wife and I were meeting, we visit him 3-4 times every year. Burke, no, 3-4 years, once a year for several years. Honored to do that in Vermont. And he's not only a scholar, but he has a devotional heart. He loves this place. He may be talking about that, but no, he loves to come here. So just, one of the inside reasons why we held this event here is to give Burke another reason to come to New Bernard, because we know he likes us so much. And as a devotional heart and a friend, he's also, in many ways, our best critic. A lot of people study in ISKCON society, and Burke speaks very straightforwardly, and he points out, helps us understand better some of our strengths, and he helps us point out oftentimes where we haven't done so well. And I think sometimes people may not be willing to tell us, but because Burke is part of our extended family, he tells us. So I was really excited when we were first talking about holding this event, and we looked at a date that worked for New Vrindavan, and I think the very first person we called outside of Jai Krishna to see if the place was available, and our organizing team, the first person we called was Burke, saying, hey, can you come at this particular time? And he could. So if you like the weather, another reason to thank him, because he's the one that had it happen on today. Okay, so hooray for Burke for the sunshine, right? Okay, so without further ado, let's give a nice warm welcome. And please, not just warm welcome, open ears.
I've known Burke for many years as Burke Rochford, yet you keep saying Rochford. Will you clarify?
It is Rochford.
Yes, it is.
Oh.
Okay?
But I respond to anything close.
And he just clarified he responds to anything close. Okay? And since this is not a Scientology meeting, we'll stop that discussion. There's no need to talk about clearing things up anymore. So, let's give a nice warm welcome. Keep your ears open.
I sort of wish you could all just sort of stand here and look out and see all these wonderful men that are out here. It's kind of a rare, really very rare opportunity, in fact, so I appreciate that. I want to thank Anutama for inviting me to come for this particular gathering. Okay. New Vrindavan, he's right. New Vrindavan is a very special place to me, as it is for many devotees. I'm someone who has to be reminded that Krishna is real. And in this place, I have no doubt whatsoever that Krishna is real. In my everyday life, I'm forgetful of that fact. So there's something very important to me about being here whenever I come. So I'm thankful for the opportunity, and I'm particularly thankful to see all of you, actually. There was this, I was thinking about this, you know, I'm coming to talk to all men, and I was reminded that I've only been at one other ISKCON event that was a single sex. And that was in the early 1990s. I went to what was then the second women's conference in Alachua. There may be one or two of you who know about that, or maybe even who were there. And when I went, I gave a presentation there, and other than Dayananda Maharaj, who came for a very short period and made a few comments, I was the only man there. And I participated in everything, including they went to a spring. Somebody from Alachua can tell me the name of that spring. I don't quite.
High Springs.
High Springs, I think that's right. The women had an event to go out there and to go swimming and to have a feast there. So to my surprise, I was actually invited. I was just told not to go near the swimming hole. Which I did, I honored that request. And so I went, and it was really a nice event. The hard part of it was, of course, all the women wanted to kind of serve me in some way. They were all running around trying to look after me, and I kept trying to duck their assistance in that regard. But later, one of the women referred to that event and my presence there as Burke and the 108 Gopis. And I suspect I'll never ever forget that, actually. It still kind of just knocks me over to think about it. So anyway, now I'm here probably in the right place for me to be, which seems to be more than 108 men, but I don't know what the equivalent saying might be in this particular case. What is it?
Gopa.
Oh, okay, Gopa, all right. So anyway, let me tell you what I'm doing here. My training and my way of thinking is to be contrasted with, I think, the wonderful class that Anutama gave this morning. And in some ways I thought as I was listening that he probably should be the person who's standing here rather than me. Because I thought he did a wonderful job on the one hand, but I think he also probably spoke in a way that for everyone in the temple at that moment was something they could relate to in a very deep way. And I also felt that. But my training is a sociologist, and you're going to see that on display here, because really what I'm up to is presenting a history, okay, of men within ISKCON, but my focus really is men and relationship to family. As I'll say later as I go forward, that's where we all, for the most part, end up, okay? Even though we may have aspired to be celibate and live as renunciates, as brahmacharis, most of us end up in the context of family life. And I want to kind of raise up that as a central focus of this particular talk. Okay? So inevitably I have to talk about women to some degree, inevitably I have to talk about children to some degree, but I do want to talk primarily about men in that context. And there's a history here that I think, I guess I'm really struck by the fact that there's so many devotees here that are young and who may not be entirely familiar with that history. Some of you who are older perhaps feel that they know too much of that history in a certain kind of way. But I do think it's important to kind of look at the changing conceptions of men as the movement itself has changed. Okay? And so there are powerful changes that have taken place that I want to get to by looking at ISKCON and men in a kind of a developmental sense. Okay? The other thing is that the title of my talk, Anutama, I think, put a title on my talk, which he didn't particularly ask me about. But I probably wouldn't have done what he suggested anyway. But anyway, so I have a different title for the talk. I think it stresses a little more what I'm up to here and what I'm going to do. So I'm calling this Devoting Men in the Context That Shape and Have Shaped Our Lives. And I use our in a very direct sort of way, because in this talk, even though I'm very academic and it can sound like I'm at a distance in a certain kind of way, I don't feel so much at a distance. When my wife saw that title, she said, but why are you saying our? Why aren't you saying their? So I'm trying to just break down that divide in some particular way. Now, some of this I'm going to read, and some of it I'm just going to move away from and talk as I would normally talk. So just be advised that that's part of what how I'm going to present this. But I want to begin with a kind of a preamble in a certain kind of way, because I think this talk has, or not this talk, but I think this retreat for men has real significance, not only for ISKCON, but I think historically has significance in the ways that we, ironically, don't pay attention to men, or at least we don't pay attention to certain kind of men. So I want to talk a little bit about that and contextualize that. So let me just begin with this preamble, which, as I say, I think points to the importance of this conference, this mantra, or this mantra. The telling of history is almost always a narrative about men. It's almost always a narrative about men. When historians dig out historical documents as they seek to analyze and reconstruct history, it is inevitably a project that tells us far more about men than it does about women or children. Due to men's power and position historically, the documents historians find are typically the product of men and written from men's perspective. Because of this, men are known or understood in the historical record as the instruments, or perhaps the engines of history. Thankfully, over the past 30 years or so, this has begun to change. Scholars, many of whom are women, have uncovered important ways that women have shaped history in America and elsewhere. Their data sources often differ: women's diaries and journals, and newsletters and other documents from various women's groups and organizations, such as the Women's Temperance League, and groups that are associated with the first wave of the women's movement in the 19th century. Given the scholarship, and it really has been a very, very productive field, actually, given the scholarship, we now accept that women's history is in fact American history. But there's another distortion that continues to shape our historical understanding. This one relates more directly to what we're doing here in this particular retreat dealing with devoted men. When we say that history has traditionally been men's history, we are really only talking about certain men. When we say that history has traditionally been men's history, we're really only talking about men who are societal elites or otherwise well-known and important figures. These, after all, are the men who produce and are often the focus of the historical documents that historians uncover.
Sir, what was, you mentioned two. The second was well-known, and what was the first?
The first one were just societal elites. Also important nonetheless, but certain men are not necessarily elites in the sense that they have political or economic power, but they're nevertheless recognized as being as significant. These, after all, these men, these elites and these important men, these, after all, are men who produce and are often the focus of the historical documents that historians uncover. To the extent this is true, we ultimately know far less about the lives and contributions of ordinary men, and I don't mean ordinary in some pejorative sense, but just rank and file, ordinary men in religious groups of one sort or another, or in history more broadly. What we understand as history fails to the extent that it overlooks the great majority of men who work, raise families, and contribute in multiple ways to the public affairs of their communities. So while we have thankfully raised women up as contributors to history, we have unfortunately paid less attention to ordinary men. And here I don't, as I say, and here I don't need to use that in some dismissive way. In fact, I want to do just the opposite. That in a certain kind of way, the men in this audience, is what I'm suggesting, haven't necessarily been heard, even though they are in a fundamental way the backbone of this movement. And that sometimes is forgotten because we want to talk about men who are special in some particular way. Now, I think in ISKCON's history, we know a great deal about certain men. In the 1970s, when Prabhupada began initiating a considerable number of his disciples as sannyasis, there was a great number, actually, that were made sannyas in the early 1970s to the mid-1970s. And they were important in pushing forward Prabhupada's movement. There's no question about it. They were the ones pushing for preaching. They were the ones pushing for book distribution, and they played a very vital role in that particular regard. But they also set a certain kind of standard in the ways in which, because of their emphasis, that women and family life was something that was not something that was obviously supported by these men who were making sannyas. Okay? So we know about that, and we know about their influence much more so than we would other kinds of men. We also know about the gurus, okay? All men. Okay? And we know about them in positive ways, but we also know, and I think those of us, such as myself, who've written about ISKCON's history, have put a lot of attention into looking at the controversies and scandals that surrounded the gurus and the guru institution, and the effect that had on religious authority within the movement itself, particularly in the 1980s, 90s, and really right up until today. We also know some other things. We know that in the early part of the movement, and into the 1980s, that men, in every case that I can think of, were temple presidents. That changed in the 1980s for reasons I'm going to talk about here momentarily, when there weren't men who were really willing or able to serve in that capacity, because at that point men were having to go out and get jobs and so forth and so on. And so women at that point started to find positions as temple presidents. That still goes on to some extent, but again, the focus really was on men, and they served in those high-level capacities more so than did women. And really, it wasn't until Malachi became a GBC about 20 years ago that all men served on the GBC. So men historically have played a very significant role within ISKCON itself.
What is GBC?
Pardon?
You're good? What is GBC?
Oh, the governing body commission for ISKCON. In other words, they're the governing body of this particular institution. Now, as I look at my own writings on ISKCON and that of some other scholars of the movement, it becomes abundantly clear to me that ISKCON's history is distorted to the extent that we overly focus on men, that is to say, again, elite men. Clearly, this has come at the expense of greater understanding of the movement as a whole. Thankfully, we now know more, though perhaps not enough, about the many contributions of devotee women. Some of this has come from scholars like Kim Knott, Susan Palmer, myself, and some others, but I think probably more importantly than these scholarly treatments of women has come from devotee women within ISKCON itself. Joy Tirmai, anybody who's interested in the kind of developing history of women within ISKCON might want to read her particular paper. It's a very interesting and I think a very compelling one, although for some a bit controversial. Also Jamuna, also Pranada, Radha, Vishaka, and others have now, I think, provided us with a pretty rich history of women within ISKCON itself. However, we still have this gaping hole. We really don't know that much about devotee men who are not part of this elite class. It's kind of a strange thing when you think about it. given the importance of men in this movement, and I'm just thinking now of the disciples of the roughly 5,000 disciples that Prabhupada initiated, roughly 3,500 of them were men. So men have played a very, very significant role in this movement, and yet, in a very curious way, we don't know enough about those men. So, as I began preparing for this particular presentation, I actually was quite embarrassed to realize that in my own work I've neglected these men. Not because I haven't spoken to these men, not because I haven't interviewed these men, not because they haven't been respondents in surveys that I have done, but that I haven't made men's experience itself a topic. I haven't talked to men about themselves and their experiences in being a member of this movement and their efforts to become Krishna conscious. Interestingly, I have asked women, but I have not focused in on men. And I think part of it is just trends in the academic world that at the time when women's history was becoming important and people began studying and being conscious about women in a way that they weren't about men, at least the kind of men that I'm now talking about. Now, I'm not gonna really overcome that shortfall here. I'm gonna try, but I realize it's a somewhat feeble attempt, just because I haven't made it a serious point of inquiry for my own research. But I do think that the history that I provide, and this really very much is a history, provides us with some understanding and hopefully some kind of guide to our own collective thinking to begin thinking about, really, devoting men. So that's kind of my modest kind of hope in all of this. And how these men, or how all of us, think about what it means to be a man in Krishna consciousness in terms of our service to Krishna, our service to Prabhupada and to ISKCON, but more so to our own families. I really, really believe that what's central here is family life and householder life and the role of men in family and householder life. That's where all this is coming from. And I think the history that I present hopefully will give a sense of that. So what do I have to offer? Well, let me start with a very short quote by a rabbi and a scholar who talks about the relationship between religion and, as he speaks of it, as householder life. He says the following. This is Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. And he says the following. He says, from my point of view, there aren't any from my point of view, wherever there aren't any householders, a religion can't live. It needs to have a matrix in which it is embedded. Let me read that again. From my point of view, wherever there aren't any householders, a religion can't live. It needs to have a matrix in which it is embedded. And that which is embedded in, or that matrix, is the family itself. That's what's enduring. Right? Monastic life lasts for a period of time. Some people remain in monastic life, but it begins to shrink. Right? And where people end up ultimately is in the context of family. So I want to talk about men in that particular context. And I also want to talk about the ways in which ISKCON has responded to family and to householder life. And as part of that, the response also to women. Now, so the question for us is how do men, what is the role of men, and also women, in this evolving matrix that we know as the Grahastha ashram within ISKCON itself? Right? So, I now want to talk about this history. Okay? And I want to look at that history in terms of ISKCON's 50 years of existence, which obviously is a mammoth kind of task to think about. But I want to look at three periods. Okay? and focus in again on men in these particular periods. The first is the early days of the movement, when the ideal for men was to remain as brahmacharis, where marriage was considered maya, a term we don't actually hear that much about these days, which is kind of interesting the way the terminology falls out of service at various points in time. Where marriage was considered maya, and protection of women often meant control rather than ensuring the safety and well-being of wives and other devoted women. The second period, and I think the second period actually is probably the most important period in ISKCON's history. That changed things forever and affects ISKCON in a very significant way today. The second period involves significant changes in the lives of men, women, and children, resulting from the demise of ISKCON's communal structure and the ascendancy of the nuclear family. As I say, this was a profound change that affected really the lives of every ISKCON member. And then finally, the third period is the one I know least about, but I'm now kind of feeling heartened by the fact that there's so many younger devotees here who can speak about this in a way that I can't really very well, which has to do with, of course, the second and third generation, which, whether some people want to resist this idea or not, we're all sort of, who have gray beards and gray hair, we're all going to the next life and the next world that we're entering in. And so increasingly this is falling in the hands of these devotees. That's just reality. That's just reality. So we need to know, and we need to talk about these particular men and what the emphasis is going to be in terms of this movement, in terms of preparing and helping these men to deal with marriage and to deal with household life. Okay, so let me then talk about this first period. Again, some of you may know about this. Some of you who are younger will know something about it, but what detail I just don't know. But this idea that men as brahmacharis, marriage is maya, and protection is control. So let's just think about this. Who were the men who joined and the women who joined ISKCON? Well, most of them were obviously young. Many of them in various ways were disillusioned with American society. And virtually all of them, some who one wonders whether that was necessarily the drawing pull that led them into ISKCON, were seeking a spiritual way of life. Renunciation, world rejection, preaching, striving for spiritual realization, creating an ideal devotee community were all goals of Prabhupada's early disciples. And communalism was the structure in which all that was taking place. Not immediately. In New York City, actually, there was no particular communal structure when Prabhupada first began. Of course, there weren't very many devotees either. But this changed when Prabhupada's disciples, some of his disciples, Mukunda and some others, went to San Francisco. And suddenly this insignificant group in New York now became a very significant and developing movement. Well, what happened in San Francisco? Well, again, there were young people, men and women, who were often disillusioned with American society. Many of them had traveled to San Francisco because what happened in 1967 that was, from the countercultural history point of view, what happened in 67? Summer of Love. Okay? He died. So in 67, there were literally tens of thousands of young hippies who were traveling all over the country and indeed the world to go to San Francisco, to the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco specifically. And where were the devotees? In the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco. Now there was an issue there for them because in the first year and a half in San Francisco, the estimates are that about 150 to 200 people joined in San Francisco. What do you do with those 150 to 200 people when they have no permanent residence in San Francisco? You develop a communal structure. people began living in the temple, and this kind of communal structure emerged there. And as ISKCON then was transplanted to other places, that communal structure became kind of a normative element of the movement. Communalism was the structure in which this movement developed. And that structure lasted up through, at least in this country, to about 1980, when it began to disintegrate. And I'll talk in a minute about why that was. Now, in this communal context, renunciation really became the ideal. Austerity, renunciation. These were the elements that made for a good devotion. Those who could do that successfully were seen very much in those terms. To be a man, that is to be a spiritually determined man, was to be a brahmachari. That was the ideal. Think about that. You're 21, you're 18, you're 25, and the hope, what you're striving for, is to be a brahmachari for your life. And we know that very, very few men were able to pull that off. And those who did, we should bow at their feet, quite frankly, because that's not an easy thing to have done. The overwhelming number of men did marry. Now, the mantra, and I do mean mantra, of the times for brahmacharis was that marriage was maya and thus to be avoided. Overpowered by sexual desire, the thinking was that only spiritually weak men chose to marry. Think about that. I recall in LA in the mid-1970s being told that the brahmacharis had what amounted to a wake of sorts when one of their fellow brahmacharis decided to marry. It was a very sad kind of event. Not only were they thinking about their lost friend, but also they had to kind of build themselves up in the face of someone who was now leaving this way of life, which they were, in many cases, struggling to kind of preserve. Okay? As one former ISKCON devotee stated about the mindset of the brahmacharis in the 1970s, and this is somebody who has somewhat of a tarnished name, I think, amongst a lot of devotees, Nori Muster, who wrote a book on ISKCON about her life as a devotee, and pretty critical about that. She wrote an article called "Life as a Woman on Watsika Avenue," and in that article she says the following. Again, this is speaking about men during this early period. She says, "The men thought it Vedic to spit on the ground to demonstrate the resentment towards women. They got their cue from a stanza in the scriptures and said," in the stanza that she's citing, which I assume is accurate, was from the Bhagavatam. She, quote, "Since I have been engaged in the transcendental loving service of Krishna, realizing ever new pleasure in him, whenever I think of sex pleasure, I spit at the thought and my lips curl with distaste." So this was kind of a mentality that existed at that particular time. And again, I think part of it is, these were young men. This was not easy. Okay? So they had to work at it. They had to struggle kind of internally, and they also had to kind of provide some kind of ideological justifications for the fact that this was not easy. Okay? And so some of this was an overreaction to their own difficulty. But still was an ideal, there's no doubt. Now, this thinking carried over in a number of domains. Some of you that grew up in the ashram Gurukula can talk about this far more than I can, but in the Gurukula itself, there was this idea we have to separate the boys from the girls, that I've heard men's accounts that if they were caught kind of staring at a young girl on the other side of the temple, they could be chastised for it or be punished for it. Right? I remember, not quite an aside, but I remember in 1992 or 3, I can't quite remember the year now, I taught down in Alachua, Florida at Murli Vadaka's invitation to the ashram of boys there. They were one of the only places at that point where the ashram Gurukula still existed. And when he asked, I said, I will come, but I will not only teach the boys. You guys work it out. You work it out with Lakshmi Moni, who was the head of the girls' ashram and a teacher. You work it out. I'll either teach the boys and then teach the girls, but I'm not just going to teach the boys. I'm not going to do that. So they worked out between them that we would do it together. It was a bit of a scandal, actually. There was displeasure at this idea, and they carried forward with it anyway. And then there was an event. Well, before I get to the event, so I would be teaching these young boys and girls. That when I say young, they were like 14, 15, in that range, I would say at that time. So, they're at that age where they're eyeing each other up, clearly. So when the boys were on one side and the girls were on the other side, just as you would expect, and then the breaks would come. And they would be chatting each other up, boys and girls, in ways that you can imagine boys and girls might do that. There's nothing serious, but you know what I'm saying, right? So in the midst of this teaching, one night, the boys snuck out of the ashram and went over to the girls' ashram. Innocent stuff, by the way. What they were doing is they were just going to the girls' windows and they were talking through the window to one another. Okay? Lakshmi Moni, in her ever cleverness, I suppose, she sort of saw this coming and she put yarn all the way around the house. So if the yarn was tripped, she knew the boys had shown up. And guess what? The boys showed up. The next day, the teaching stopped. Okay, it didn't stop altogether, but it stopped. And there were some people in the community itself who just were basically saying, I told you so. You should not have done this. Right? So there was this kind of tension that existed. The other just quick story I would tell, and it was here at New Vrindavan. There's somebody I interviewed who was in the ashram here, and one day he was chastised by his ashram teacher, who said to him, do you want to be a brahmachari, or are you going to be a mamachari? So they were going after, mothers in a certain kind of way at that particular time too. And because the ashram teacher didn't want him to kind of reveal to his mother something that had happened in the ashram. And this is how he chastised him. Okay? So this was kind of the mentality that existed at this particular time. So clearly, at this particular point in time, marriage and householder life were not natural and healthy progressions in men's lives, but instead an evil to be avoided. I think probably there's very few people in this room who would not say that for most men, this is a kind of a natural and a progressive thing that happens as we grow older. We do marry, we do have children. Okay? And this was something that they were at that time trying to avoid. Now, Anutama this morning talked about protection, which I was really gratified that he did. And protection was central in many ways to all of this. That, because women, on the one hand, women represented a challenge to men, and therefore should be avoided in a certain way, to maintain their celibacy. But there was also the requirement that women be protected. So how do you do this? Okay? It sets up a kind of an interesting kind of problem. Right? In fact, Prabhupada commented at one point, he said, of course it is better to remain unmarried celibate. If someone comes to Krishna, it is our duty to give them protection. Women must have a husband to give protection. And in fact, for women, their fulfillment spiritually was in married life and having children and raising Krishna-conscious children. So it was, in a sense, a kind of an elevation of their status and position and identity by marrying. And yet, on the other hand, we had men who were fighting internally, trying not to get married. Right? So it set up a dilemma, a serious dilemma, actually. So what happens? Well, protection was not the kind of protection that Anutama was talking about, that we do whatever we can to protect and to advance the best health spiritual and otherwise, of our wives and women more generally. Right? Rather, too often, protection was seen as control. Let me just read, and this may be a somewhat overly dramatic recitation of this, but there was a woman I interviewed in 1980 who said the following to me. There's kind of a history to this quote because in the first book I wrote, I took this out. There were some devotees that were reading the manuscript and commenting on it, and they just took offense at this because I think they realized this was just not going to go over very well, and they really wanted it out. And for reasons I wish I had not fallen to at that time, I took it out. Except I saved it because it came out in the next book. So I didn't lose it altogether. So this woman says to me, she says, "I've never so much regretted being born in a woman's body since I joined the ISKCON movement. I've never been so much criticized, abused, slandered, misunderstood, or chastised because I have this woman's body. If you are a single woman, every man thinks he is an authority and will yell at you if he feels like it. But it is worse when you are married because you have one authority and you have to surrender to his inflexible, lord-it-all nature, whether he is right or wrong, and whether he is nice or cruel about how he relates to you." Now, obviously, this is not, I'm not saying that this was the case in every marriage, because it clearly wasn't. But this was a kind of way of thinking that too many women were subject to this kind of thing. Let's put it in those terms, I suppose. So again, this may be overly dramatic, but still there was this sense of the necessity of control. Control of women before marriage so that women wouldn't become a problem and draw you into marriage, and then once you were in a marriage, there was a certain sense of control for any host of reasons, I suppose, in terms of why men would want to control women. Now the question is, I guess, why? Well, part of the reason why is that marriage and family represented a threat to book distribution and sankirtan, or preaching. The thinking is that men and women who married would be less available to go on book distribution and to, in other ways, contribute to the maintenance of a temple. So from the leadership's point of view, there was also reason to kind of control marriage because of a fear, and they were driven by good motives, I'm not saying that. They wanted to continue to advance the movement. They wanted to continue to preach. They wanted to continue to distribute books that Prabhupada was encouraging them to do. So it's not that they were acting from motives that were not themselves good motives, but the effect of that had a detrimental kind of consequence for women, and I have to say it also had a detrimental consequence for men as well. Now, Prabhupada's had a lot of different things, but he said something that was quite different on this count than what came to be the prevailing idea about marriage, about women, and about householder life more generally. He said in a 1976 lecture, and I think it's just really quite interesting that the way he says this. He says, "If you can remain without sex life, brahmachari, it is very good. But if you cannot, then get yourself married, live with wife, and only have sex for progeny, not for sense enjoyment. Therefore, if one is married, if he is sticking to one wife, and wife sticking to one man, that is real married life. Then the husband," and this is what's interesting, "then the husband is also called brahmachari, even though he is grahasta." So if you have a good marriage, if you're sticking with one wife and wife is sticking with you, okay, and you've constructed a marriage in a way that's spiritually beneficial to each other, and presumably psychologically, materially beneficial to each other, then Prabhupada's saying this is like living as a brahmachari, but now you're doing it in the context of marriage life. So he wasn't saying, at least in this particular quote, yes, brahmachari, staying celibate is good, but if you have a marriage that's based on Krishna conscious principle, you are also brahmachari. And then in 1972, he says something also very interesting. And I'll pick up on this a little more in a moment. 1972, this is early. Prabhupada stated that married couples, and by the way, even by 1972, before that, everybody would come to Prabhupada and say, I want to marry so-and-so. And he would say, oh, okay. He would give a certain benediction to it. He became so frustrated with his disciples with all their marital problems, he said, I don't want any more of it. Okay? But in 1972, Prabhupada says, married couples should be required to, quote, produce some outside income and live outside the temple. That didn't happen. Or if it happened pretty rarely. Okay? In fact, I actually never have heard anyone mention that quote until it was something I just kind of, in reading Prabhupada's material, found this quote. Why? Because nobody mentioned it. And why didn't they mention it? Because if married couples got independence from the leader's point of view, they were losing people who otherwise could be going on a book distribution and preaching. So they didn't honor this statement by Prabhupada. Because independence itself was a threat. It was deemed as a threat to ISKCON and its goals. And again, it might have been. So it's not just control without a purpose, but it is controlling. I remember in terms of this independence, I remember in this probably was in 76 or 77. There was a family in the LA temple who made a move which at that time was seen as a dramatic move. They chose to move a few apartment complexes down on Watsika Avenue from the boundaries of the devotee community. This was very controversial. This was very controversial. And what was said about them was, they must be going down there because they have some kind of sinful kind of purpose in mind. At that time, it could be something as simple as they probably wanted to watch TV, okay? or something, right? And from thereafter, they were always seen, again, another word we don't hear much of anymore, they were seen as what? Fringies, right? They were seen as fringies at that time. So here they were, literally moving about 100 yards down the street. And with that 100 yards, they went from being devotees to standing, which they were, by the way. I mean, the wife and the man, father, husband, they did service. They were active in the temple. In fact, the husband, I don't know whether you guys do this, but in the temple, I always stood in one place. Whenever I went to the temple, he always stood in the same place. So it always kind of annoyed me, and I probably annoyed him. But he was always there, okay? So it wasn't a fringy in the sense that he removed himself from doing what he was doing before when he moved that 100 yards, okay? But it was a sense of independence, and that was not something that at that time people were comfortable with. Now, let me just say this, though. It's just to end this section. We might just look at this, and of course I've been playing it up, that this kind of gender traditionalism and this, even outright sexism that existed in ISKCON during this particular period, it wasn't so peculiar. A little peculiar, but not so peculiar. We have to remember that the women's movement, the second wave of the women's movement, occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Why did it come about at that time? Because women activists that were a part of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement faced such discrimination and such disregard by their brothers in each of these respective movements that women at that point began to mobilize for women's rights against the kind of discrimination that they were facing, even amongst these good liberal boys that they were working with. Okay? So it's not the story we're telling here about ISKCON, yeah, it has its peculiarities, but it was not something that was all that unusual. I mean, those of us who are of my age grew up at a time where what we now call discrimination, nobody recognized at all. That's just what men and women did. So, it was not that unusual. So there's another part of the historical context here that exists even beyond ISKCON itself. Okay. Now, the second part of this. The demise of communalism. The ascendancy of the nuclear family. And the changing views of family life and in the roles of men and women. In some ways, this second period, or this second moment, which basically lasted from about 1980, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, when these changes were taking place during the 1980s in the main, were radical changes in ISKCON itself. It may have been radical for young boys and girls joining ISKCON, living a culturally very different life. That was radical, no doubt. But this was also very radical because it had such a profound impact on people's lives. And it begins and kind of ends, really, with book distribution. Book distribution grew enormously through the 1970s. And indeed, the movement's expansion worldwide was really fueled by revenues from book distribution. The preaching was going on, but it was generating a lot of money, let's just be honest. And I wouldn't say that the leaders were misusing the money. They were using the money for expansionary purposes. It's all good. Okay? But what happens is, in 1980, in 1976, based on some work that I have done, it's not absolutely precise, but pretty precise, book distribution reached its peak in the U.S., or North America really, in 1976. Of course, Prabhupada's disappearance was in 1977. It slips a little bit in 77. In 1980, it crashes. About 1/4 to 1/3 of the number of books were distributed in 1980 as in 1976. In 4 years, it dropped that much. Revenues coming into temples also dropped basically that much. Okay? So there was a massive kind of economic problem. Communalism is, even as the devotees were living very austerely, it still cost money to make all that work, right? There had to be buildings for them to live in, and places to live, there had to feed them, and so forth and so on. So now the revenue coming into the temples was dramatically less than it had been. So what happens? Well, in a lot of ways it came down to temple presidents seeing that the bottom line just wasn't working, and they would come and tap, a householder, husband, father on the shoulder and saying, Prabhu, we just don't have enough to make this work. You need to go out and get a job, and you need to establish your family separately, okay? Because we can't do it anymore. And that's basically what happened. So there was a financial kind of factor that really influenced this in a very significant way. So what happens? Well, not only to men and women do they have to now go out and establish a household, but now their children, of course the ashram was still in existence, their children now were reunited with their mothers and their fathers, for the most part. The Lake Huntington Gurukula in upstate New York went on until maybe 83 or 84. I know that, but I forget the exact date. 85.
I was there.
Okay, 85.
They moved to Halaj.
Yes, it did. In fact, that becomes itself an interesting kind of point, because not only were these these householders having to start their own households, but now they had to get jobs and worry about all that. But now what to do with our children who were in these schools and now no longer, they have to figure out something else. Well, I think an argument that can be made that Alachua grew in the way that it grew as a function of this. That Murli Vadaka and Lakshmi Moni, who at that time were considered probably the premier teachers in ISKCON, moved to Alachua. Their ashrams continued in Alachua. Ashrams became less and less common throughout the 80s, and so Alachua was seen was the place to go if you had children. So it wasn't just the warm weather. There were other reasons. And this was the important. So I think this was the beginnings of what we now see in Alachua, quite frankly. And there's still really good schools in Alachua, so that's kind of continued in another form. Now, so what happens then? Well, so you're starting a household. What does that mean? Well, men and some women had to go out and get jobs. Some were able to maintain themselves in the temples, but there was just not enough to keep you occupied and paying you enough money to, pay for rent on an apartment and so forth and so on. Okay? And these newly formed households now, men and women had to work out their own kind of division of labor amongst themselves. Under communalism, well, you probably didn't have to cook your own food. You might have had to do that, but you didn't have to do that. You weren't interacting as a household and making a household work with your children. So these were necessities that had to be resolved. The consequences of that, in some of these households, there's left not so happy. Okay, and you have to also remember, in the early 80s, the controversies around the gurus were also very much in play. So there were devotees who were not a happy bunch in many respects. But now that they were working, they were wearing, they had child responsibilities. The number of people who were getting up for the early morning program begins to slide. Mm-hmm. And for good reason. It wasn't just that they were dissatisfied. Yeah, they may have been. But, all of us who have children know the difficulties of making all that work. Service to the temple. Well, if you're working 40 hours a week, and you have children to look after, and you have other things that you're doing, service to the temple is now something that's more difficult to do, and many either cut back on the amount of service they were providing or just gave it up. So now the temples are in a quandary. They're financially struggling. The devotees themselves have begun in various ways to remove themselves for good reason from the temple. And so now the maintenance of the temples themselves becomes an issue. So this was a development that changed the lives of the devotees themselves, but also changed ISKCON in a very fundamental kind of way. Now, the nuclear family now becomes the foundational structure of devotees' lives. And in a way, it becomes the foundational structure of ISKCON itself, because ISKCON becomes a congregational movement of independent households. That independence means people can make choices to do what they choose to do, more or less. Right? So ISKCON itself was in a quandary, the temples in North America. Now, a lot of these events I'm describing did take place in other parts of the world, but it took place sometime after. Europe continued to kind of chug along for a period of time until it faced its own difficulties that were in ways quite similar to what we saw in North America. Now, in these newly formed nuclear families, men basically, although listening to Anutama, I think Anutama is quite right about this, basically men became the head of their households. My wife just really got all over me about this, actually, because she said, so you think that you're the head of this household? that's a battle you cannot win. You just cannot win. And I just fumbled, and she had me cornered. I just felt so really cornered. So I gave the answer that Anutima did, only after a few minutes of fumbling. Well, no, we're both the heads of this house. That's all I had. So to the extent that men were now the head of the household, to be a good man, like to be a good brahmachari, to be a good man was to work and provide for the material needs of one's family. It also meant that men, along with their wives, I didn't put that in there just for the sake of my wife, I'd actually written that already, but I think it's true. It also meant that men, along with their wives, were responsible for the spiritual welfare of their children. Protection thus became a partnership between husband and wife who acted as best they could in the interests of their children's well-being. So, a very different context also means a reinterpretation or a reshaping of understandings of what protection is. And I don't mean a reshaping of protection in terms of what its pure form of protection is, but in protection in terms of how it's being practiced. Okay? Now it was something that a husband and wife together had to assure for the sake of their families. Now, I guess the other thing I would just quickly say is this was just not easy for devotees, and there's no doubt that marriages suffered under trying to get their legs under them about what really were quite dramatic changes. It was not an easy thing, no doubt. There's no doubt. Now, there's one. And here I have some data, which actually I'd ask either Anutima or somebody else to pass this out now. This was a transition that basically brought significant changes in how devotees perceive both householder life and also women. And I have some tables, which I'll explain in a way for those of you who are just not table people in a minute. Hopefully that'll suffice. Some of you may remember, those who are a little bit older here, the Prabhupada Centennial Survey, which was done in 1995 and 1996 to celebrate Prabhupada's 100th birthday. It was a survey that I oversaw with the help of a whole lot of people. And there were nearly 2,000 respondents across the ISKCON world. This is the days before email, by the way, so you can imagine what this was like. This was agony, and most of that agony was, well, I like to think that most of that agony was on my shoulders, but I think it was probably on the shoulders of a lot of people, quite frankly. The survey asked people about a great variety of issues, and the survey was built, even leadership went along with this for the most part, that, you know, sensitive questions like gurus and authority, family life, views about women, views about educating children, and a host of other things. This was a very lengthy questionnaire. And then in the end, I analyzed data, wrote a report, and gave it to the GBC. Now, what you have are two tables that have agree-disagree statements about issues related to householder life and marriage. Okay? One table deals with the first, the second deals with the question of women. Now, in a minute, I'll just make a few comments about what the findings are here, but let me just kind of talk about what you're looking at. Okay?
Is there missing a disagree?
You show two degrees, either strongly agree or agree.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
And
about.
there's no disagree.
Yeah, that's where I'm heading. So what I've done here is we've all been surveyed to death, I suspect, so we know a little bit about how this works. So you have a statement like that first one in the first table there. The needs and problems of householders have been largely ignored by ISKCON's leadership. Note, first of all, that this is divided between women and men. Okay? The left side of that table has findings for women, the right side has it for men. And there's no real reason. The way these things are scaled is strongly agree, agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. That's a format that you probably suffered through before, okay? There's no real reason to report the disagree because you can compute that readily by seeing how many people or what percentage actually agree. So for example, on that first one that I just read, the needs and problems of householders have been largely ignored by ISKCON's leadership. Amongst the women, 34% strongly agree, 45% agree. So if we just look at agreement and we collapse those two categories, 79% of the women agreed, which means 21% disagreed, either strongly disagreed or just disagreed, but they disagreed, okay? In the case of, yeah.
What are the parenthetical numbers? What's that?
Oh, that's just the number of cases. Okay? So for men, 23% strongly agreed, 43% agreed. So basically 66% or 2/3 agreed with that statement, and the other 34% disagreed. Okay? So that's the way the table is set up, and comparing men and comparing women. Okay? And I'm not going to go at this in great detail, but to give you, in fact, I have a kind of a summary statement here, if I can find what I've done with my paper here. Yeah. Okay, I found this one. Okay. So on that first table, again, that first table is dealing with views about family and householder life. Okay? So I'm not going to go into the numbers so specifically, but let me just give a kind of an overview or a summary statement of what we have here. As the findings reveal, a substantial majority of both men and women strongly agree or disagree that the needs and problems of householders have been largely ignored by ISKCON's leadership. 79% of women agreed with the statement and 2/3 of the men also agreed. Similarly, large percentages also agree that the needs of family must be one of our movement's greatest concerns in the coming years. More than 80% agree. Now keep in mind, this is in the mid-1990s, when a lot of these struggles and the parties establishing these households independent of the ISKCON were, pretty well working their way out at that time, but still we're in that kind of, contextually in that time period. And that's the important thing. Today, we don't know how people would respond to this, and it may be quite different. I don't know that, but it could be. But just to give a sense of this, because a lot of debaters might say, but Burke, I've had this. This data is so old, why would we listen to this? Well, that's true, except we're talking about a particular historical period. So it's relevant for the period. Not today, but for that period. Other findings that are in that table point to both the importance and the challenges associated with householder life. Large percentages of men and women agreed that tending to the welfare of one's children was as important as any other service performed in ISKCON. 91% of the women agreed, and 86% of the men. That's a pretty important kind of finding when we think about the ways in which householder life was portrayed in the earlier period of the movement. People's attitudes may have been in ways similar to this earlier, but they certainly were out of keeping with the prevailing kind of thought at that time. But certainly by the mid-1990s, this is hardly a shocking kind of finding, I think. Another one there, the demands of work and family life have limited ISKCON involvement. Women 63%, men 57% agreed. Fathers should work and support their families, and mothers should care for children and home. Women 61%, kind of interesting because it's a fairly significant difference here, and men more so agreed with that particular statement. And I think in a way that's a statement that by no means does it define every nuclear family, but these are the kind of traditional ideas that exist within traditional families. And then the future of ISKCON lies with the commitment of the movement's children, women 84% and men 77%. In other words, basically in all of these questions here dealing with family, there's agreement that householder life should have more importance within the family, with ISKCON itself, and that looking after one's children is important, and that they haven't always felt supported in terms of the importance being placed on householder life by ISKCON itself. Now we see something again on the second table, and this is one that I think if you look at it, you probably think, well, why would you ask these questions? Because mostly today, these are things that are already in play, and they're not at all controversial for most devotees. Not all, but most. So in this particular one, the same strategy, the same alignment in terms of women and men, and agree, disagree with these statements. The biggest difference here is in the strength of agreement. That women, you wouldn't be surprised to know, are more supportive of greater rights or greater opportunities for women than are the men. But overall, both are in agreement. Okay? So it has to do with strength of agreement. Women are more likely to say that they strongly agree. Okay? So in this one, women and men both agree that the women should be allowed to chant in the temple with men, have equal access to the deities during worship, and have the same opportunities as men to realize their potential in devotional service. In addition, both men and women agree that performance, not gender, should be the criterion for placement in an ISKCON position. Both sexes agree that women are the spiritual equals of men, and that Prabhupada never intended for women devotees to be treated as other than equal to devotee men. Finally, there's strong agreement that over time, male attitudes have become more accepting of devotee women. Now, again, just kind of to underscore, I think a lot of these really are past history. Women are no longer standing in the back of the temple. Women are no longer pushed out of the temple room where men are chanting out into the cold in some places, quite frankly, because they would be a distraction to men's chanting and therefore their spiritual lives. These were things that did go on in those days. Not everywhere, but some places. Okay. Now, I think just the important thing about these findings is not to get overly dwell on them, but I think they point or they suggest that there are, I think, I don't know if profound's the word I want, but significant changes in the ways in which devotees were looking at household life and women in comparison to that early period. That there were some fundamental changes that were taking place in devotees' attitudes. And I think part of this also then were raising some serious questions about the ways they thought about ISKCON and the ways that they were treated, or the ways householder life was treated within the context of ISKCON. After the fact, surely, but nonetheless, it's suggestive of some, I think, quite significant changes. And these are changes that are real. They're in their lives, right? So again, not necessarily surprising, but I think important. And speaks to the kind of independence that devotees now have that they simply did not have in that early period. Okay, then I've just got one more thing because time is now very short. The last one is short because I know less about it, to be frank. And that's the second and third generation, and I have here subtitled, Where Are We Today? We've already established that ISKCON is a far different movement than it was during that early period. And equally, the lives of men and women are really quite different than they were as well. And I would say that for most devotees, we can think of them as, in a sense, being bicultural. They all, not all, but most, I think, who are householders at least, have a foot in both the culture and world of ISKCON and a foot in the mainstream society. Because that's where they've gone to find work mostly. That's where they're living mostly. And consequently, they are quite familiar with both worlds, and they're living in both worlds. So they are, in a certain kind of way, bicultural. The other thing I would say here, and this raises, I think, the significance of the second and third generation. And here, when I say the second and third generation, I'm mostly talking about, the words here are not precise, but kind of Westerners, who are the descendants of that first generation. I think a context for this is, if you think of the average ISKCON temple and who fills it on a Sunday, they're mostly not Westerners who are descendants of Prabhupada disciples, and maybe disciples who came after Prabhupada, and their children and perhaps their grandchildren. Okay? That increasingly, and I get myself in a lot of trouble for this one by some leaders, that I think ISKCON temples have in large part become ethnic churches, it's a technical term, for immigrant Hindus and their families, ethnic Hindus and their families. I make no judgment about that, it's just that it's true, okay, in most cases. Okay. Now, I think that means that these second and third generation devotees are critically important if they are the true descendants of Prabhupada's theology and Prabhupada's particular emphasis on Krishna consciousness. The ethnic Hindus who go to those temples, some are very consistent with it, many aren't. Okay? So Prabhupada came to the West with the hopes of recruiting Westerners to Krishna consciousness. So for me, those descendants are critically important. And I make a distinction here, again, and I get into trouble for this. Again, I have no, it's not that I have a point of view about it. Well, I do have a point of view about it, but I don't have I'm not angry about it in any sense of the word. But I do think that ISKCON itself is not the same movement that it was, and of course that's no surprise, but it's mostly an institution that's filled, in terms of temple life, with people who aren't Westerners. Prabhupada's movement, in terms of what's particular about Prabhupada's teachings, I think exists going forward with the second and third generation. That's a controversial statement. A lot of people will not agree with me. Okay? But I think they are vitally important. Vitally important. And it's also important, I have to say too, for those who are ethnic Indians, to the extent that they are also committed to Prabhupada's way, let's just say, to help teach their own children that way, but also to engage in the project of trying to help Westerners come to ISKCON. That I think they have to join in that effort to the extent that they feel that commitment to ISKCON. They may not, but to the extent they do, I think that is something they can do and ought to try and do. I'm just worrying in my own mind about what this is going to look like in another 50 years. What will historians be writing about the Hare Krishna movement then? Now, I have some other things I could say here about this, but I think in a certain kind of way that was my bottom line. I think the Kuli Mela from whenever it was 2 years ago was a real sign of, I think, something very important. I'll just say that the theme of that particular Mela that was here in Vrindavan, where there was a large crowd, 700 adults, 100 children, and so forth. The theme was celebrating family and building community. We need more of that. We need a lot more of that. And these younger devotees are the ones who are leading the charge, because it's their lives. You know, I look around here. There's a few of us in this room that are really quite old, and every day I read the devotee websites, and every day almost one of us is passing on. It either falls to them and they do something with it, or what all this is going to come to in a relatively short period of time is going to look very different. And I personally am worried about that, or concerned about it. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I have some questions that I think will not happen here, but I think there's some there are some other sessions that are taking place that may choose to look at those questions, and somebody can pass them out just so that you have them, and some other ways that these questions can get discussed. Time just isn't going to make it work here. Okay, I thank you. Yeah.